All right, so we are moving on to concept B3, which is the next concept in our unit on the human reproductive systems. And today we're going to have a look at menstrual cycle. So you should have had a look at the female reproductive system and oogenesis already and have an idea of what's going on with that. Now we're going to move into something that is closely tied to the female system and is actually integral to ensuring that the body is ready for fertilization and implantation of a fertilized egg and preparing for that. So that's what B3 is all about. So I'm going to go through the lesson. It's quite a bit shorter than the last one, and then I've got a list of things just to tell you about and make you aware of that I'll be putting on the Google Classroom to help you through with this stuff. As always, pause, rewind as you need to if things aren't making sense. Go back and look at it again. Don't forget you've got a textbook that you can have a quick look at, and I'm always available online. Just fire me an email and let me know what you need and what I can help you with. So the menstrual cycle. This is basically the menstrual cycle is a process that is necessary to mature one of the follicles into a dominant follicle, and to allow that follicle to be delivered through ovulation into the fallopian tube, and then so that there's a section that's associated really with the ovary and maturing the follicle and making sure that the follicle is mature and released into the fallopian tube, so that with the hopes of meeting a sperm. And then there's a second part of the menstrual cycle that involves preparing the uterus for implantation of a fertilized egg, probably an embryo by the time it gets into, or just about an embryo by the time it implants into the uterus. So there's sort of two things are going to be going on. The human female menstrual cycle consists of oogenesis, which is what's happening in the ovaries. We talked about that in the last lesson. Ovulation, and then the thickening and shedding of the endometrium. So there's sort of what's going on in the ovary, and then what's going on in the uterus, in the inner lining of the uterus, which is the endometrium. The average length of one menstrual cycle is approximately 28 days. Again, we're talking averages and generalizations. We can't say specifically that this is true for everybody. And that the entire cycle is regulated by hormones. Hormones being released from the pituitary gland that go and control hormones that are being released elsewhere around the uterus and the endometrium. So, and from the ovaries as well. So we'll get to the hormone bit again. Remember, we're going to tie in hormones. We tied in hormones with the male reproductive system and spermatogenesis. We're going to tie in hormones again with the female reproductive system, and you're going to find that we've got similar names for the hormones, or almost the same for LH and FSH. So luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, but we also have new hormones, progesterone and estrogen, that we'll talk about as well. So the menstrual cycle is divided into three phases, and we'll go through each of these phases in order, talk about what goes on, give you an idea of when they happen during the cycle, and remember, keep in the back of your mind what we're looking for is how do these parts of the cycle help to prepare for pregnancy. So we need to create an egg, or not create, mature an egg, release that. That's the ovary part of things. And then how do we prepare the endometrium and uterus for implantation? So the three phases that we're going to work with are Menses or flow phase, and know both of these terms, please. Proliferative or follicular phase, and this stage we'll note ends in ovulation, and then luteal or secretory phase. Now, for me, I kind of think of it as four parts of the cycle. Even though there are three phases, there's four parts to me that I try to remember: menses, proliferative, ovulation, and then luteal. So we've got four phases that we're going to keep an eye on. So menses or flow phase is also known as menstruation, and this is the stage when the endometrium is being shed This is menstruation. The reason that the endometrium is being shed is to reset the system to be ready at the end of or midway through the cycle for ovulation and the implantation of a fertilized egg. Menstruation lasts on average about 5 days, and we consider the first day of flow phase to be day 1 of the menstrual cycle, and this is a little bit different. So day 1 is when flow phase begins, the shedding of the endometrium begins to reset and get ready for the next part of this, or the beginning of the cycle, and it proceeds from there, and so the end of the cycle is marked then by the beginning of flow phase, if that makes any sense to you. During flow phase, a new follicle is beginning to develop, or a follicle is beginning to develop into a secondary follicle. So a primary follicle is selected, and it continues to develop in preparation for ovulation later on. So everything starts again, and we get the development of this new follicle. The next phase is proliferative or follicular phase, and this is the part of the menstrual cycle during which the final development of the follicles occur in the ovary. And here is where we're going to encounter our first hormone that is associated with this. So this part lasts from about day 6 through 13 of the cycle, and as it proceeds, the hormone estrogen begins to be secreted. Now, here's another hormone. So remember, when we talk about hormones, start to think about feedback loops and what those are going to look like for that hormone. In other words, what's the trigger? What is the change in the body system that causes this hormone to be released? And we'll get to more of that in a second. And then where is the hormone secreted from? And what is the effect of the hormone? And then what is the feedback loop that turns it off? Okay. So estrogen promotes the development of female secondary sexual characteristics. We said that testosterone does that in males at the onset of puberty. Estrogen does that in females at the onset of puberty. And it also results in the increased thickening of the endometrium. So we've got two pieces that are going on. Remember, testosterone was primary or secondary sexual characteristics, but also development of sperm. This one is, estrogen is those secondary sexual characteristics for females, along with thickening of the endometrium. And that whole thickening process is in preparation for the implantation of a zygote, okay, which is expected shortly after the end of the proliferative phase. Okay, so preparing for implantation of a zygote, which is the beginning of pregnancy. Right at the end of proliferative phase, still part of that phase, but I like to sort of think of it as a fourth part, is ovulation. And so this is the part where we remember from the last lesson that mature follicle fuses with the outside of the ovary and spills the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. And then at some point along the way, we hope that the secondary oocyte meets a sperm cell and they fertilize. That's what everything is being prepared for. This occurs around day 14 of the cycle. Again, it's not entirely not easy to be entirely accurate as to exactly what day that occurs. What you need to remember, though, is that secondary oocyte, that ovum, is only viable for about 24 hours. And so if it does not meet sperm at that time, then it basically disintegrates, there's no implantation that occurs, and pregnancy does not continue. Okay? After ovulation, I'm going to pause because we're cut off a little bit at the bottom. So after ovulation is the luteal phase. And luteal phase lasts from day 15-ish right to the end of the cycle when flow phase begins again. And this phase is all about the corpus luteum and the development of the corpus luteum, which we talked about yesterday. So full development of the corpus luteum begins, and the corpus luteum then is sitting there secreting hormones that are going to be necessary to sustain pregnancy. So it secretes progesterone, and it continues to secrete estrogen to sustain the pregnancy. We talked already about what estrogen does. Estrogen, for the purposes of pregnancy, keeps the endometrium thick and nourishes and ensures it's being nourished and develops properly for the development of the embryo and fetus later on. Progesterone, on the other hand, is a hormone that induces changes in the endometrium, and these changes prepare the uterus for the implantation of the embryo. And we'll get to exactly what those changes are in a second here. But beware that that's what's going on. At this stage, if fertilization of an egg does not occur, and implantation is when that fertilized egg implants into the endometrium. If that doesn't occur, then what happens is the corpus luteum begins to break down, and concentrations, levels of estrogen and progesterone start to drop off. Okay, and that causes right near the end, when that happens, is it causes uterine contractions. And that's the cramps that are felt at the beginning of flow phase as the endometrium is being forced to disconnect from the inner wall of the uterus. So it's being forced to disconnect, and then that endometrium is being shed during flow phase. Okay, so these contractions cause the endometrium to pull away from the uterine wall, and so menses, the beginning of flow phase, starts again. So one of the things that progesterone does is it inhibits uterine contractions. So when it's active, it is preventing the uterus from doing little contractions, which would dislodge the endometrium. And if implantation had occurred and the endometrium was to dislodge, then the developing embryo would be lost during that following flow phase. So these two diagrams that you see here are diagrams sort of trying to show you what's going on during the course of the menstrual cycle. So you can see the three phases we talked about, with flow phase starting at day 1 through day 5, follicular phase 5 through 14, and luteal phase 14 through 28. And you'll notice that there's a fourth phase, or fourth part, called the ovulatory phase, which occurs at day 14. This shows you what's happening up here to the follicle. So you can see that follicle begins to develop at the beginning of flow phase. So this is that whole primary oocyte and the follicle developing. Ovulation occurs when that follicle ruptures and fuses with the inside or the outside of the ovary and spills into the fallopian tube. And then we can see what happens with the corpus luteum, where it develops from what's left of the follicle and starts to release estrogen and progesterone. And then if implantation doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum begins to break down and hormone levels drop. What this diagram is, and I really like this one because it shows a lot of things going on in one sort of simple diagram. So up here, it's talking about basal body temperature and what changes happen to body temperature. And don't be alarmed. You know, basal body temperature, this is 36.4 down here, this is 36.7. So we're not seeing major changes in temperature. We're seeing maximum of a 0.3 difference in temperature. So those change from follicular phase through to luteal phase. You'll notice that they don't acknowledge flow phase on here as a separate phase. It would end right about here and begin here. They don't. And so moving down to the next graph that we see here, this is tracking levels of hormones. So you can see FSH and LH, estrogen and progesterone. And FSH is the light blue sort of color here, and you can see levels are relatively constant. So follicle stimulating hormone, that's follicular phase. So we're trying to stimulate the follicle to develop into a follicle that can be used by or that can mature into a secondary oocyte. You'll see it peaks and then levels drop off, and then they start to ramp up right before the beginning of flow phase again, where the follicle needs to start developing. Luteinizing hormone is going to peak. It's going to slowly ramp up as we try to bring estrogen levels up a little bit, and then it's going to peak, and then right after that we see estrogen levels spike and then start to drop off, and we see the progesterone levels for sure start to spike at that point. Estrogen is the gray line, so we see that the endometrium is thickening here. That's what the estrogen does. And then the levels drop off because the endometrium is nice and thick. And what's happening here to get this second spike is that the corpus luteum is taking over and starting to bring those levels up higher again. Okay. This is showing what's happening with the ovum and developing in the ovarian part of the cycle. And then in the uterine cycle, this is showing what's happening to the uterus. So we've got menses, which is the shedding of the endometrium. In proliferative or follicular phase, it's starting to grow, and that's the pink that you can see on here. The endometrium is thickening again. It gets quite thick during the luteal or secretory phase, and then depending on when implantation happens, we could end up stalled here, or we can start to have the disconnection leading us to the menses. Okay. At this point, I've put another resource in your Google Classroom for you guys to have a look at. This is just a diagram that I thought was kind of cool that I found on the internet one day, sort of showing basically what we just looked at in a slightly different way, sort of like a clock sort of function here. So you would start day 1 of the cycle, and we would be going menses somewhere around here, which is indicated by this darker red line. Again, depending on the person, it could be 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 days, depending on the person. This line here is the thickness of the endometrium and what's happening in the uterus. What we see in these lines are particularly progesterone levels and what's happening with progesterone levels and estradiol, which we're not going to get into. And you can see the bigger the circle, the more progesterone that's present. This is what's happening in the ovaries and the follicles developing. Ovulation is occurring here. The viability of the egg is indicated here. Corpus luteum, all sorts of things like that. And then these levels in the middle are indicating the hormone levels LH and FSH. And FSH is the dark blue, and LH is the red color. And what it's really showing that I think is interesting is that they sort of spike along the way, and those spikes are leading to little changes that we see in estrogen or progesterone levels that we're working with. Sorry, I misspoke here, and I'm going to sort of rewind. Estradiol is another name for estrogen. So this is estrogen and progesterone levels. Estradiol is the darker, progesterone is the lighter. So estrogen levels are peaking as we try to thicken the endometrium all the way through there. So another diagram that's in your resources on the Google Classroom that you might find interesting to have a look at and help you sort everything out. Where we're going here next is this is the feedback control. So this is how things are shut off and turned on for those hormones that we talked about. So again, the hypothalamus pituitary complex regulates the production of estrogen and progesterone in the ovaries. It regulates them through the use of GnRH, right, which is what we used in the male system as well. So GnRH stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it's also a player. It comes in and starts being released at the onset of puberty, and it stimulates then FSH and LH to be released from the pituitary. Remember, follicle stimulating hormone promotes the development of follicles in the ovary, right? Follicles, think ovary, please. And then luteinizing hormone, think about that as promoting ovulation and the formation of the corpus luteum. Luteum, luteinizing, make that connection. And then what happens is when we get to various stages of the menstrual cycle, if fertilization occurs, then follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormone levels will be left so that we can promote estrogen and progesterone release. And if not, then these levels will drop off. And you guys can see that in the diagram that I just showed you here, that you can see those levels peak. And if the corpus luteum starts to break down, then notice how those levels down here leading up to the end of the cycle start to disappear. And then they start to rise again when we need to start stimulating the follicles to start the cycle again. Okay, so that's that. This is a nice little summary table of those hormones again and what they do. So you can see that estrogen is involved with some of these secondary sexual characteristics like inhibiting the growth of facial hair, all those sex characteristics we talked about in the last lesson, thickening of the endometrium. Progesterone inhibits ovulation, so that will prevent the cycle from starting again if pregnancy happens. Inhibits uterine contractions. What we didn't talk about is firming the cervix. What that means is the cervix will actually start to tighten up and close up so that everything can be held inside the uterus as the embryo develops. And we'll see a little bit more of that when we move on to concept B4 later on. And then you have FSH and LH sort of going through and talking about what they do and what they stimulate. Okay, so that is the stuff I have to teach you for the menstrual cycle. I'm just going to share with you what I need you guys to do to sort of work your way through the rest of this concept. So first things first, go back over this again if you need to and have a look at things. I've also attached a video as part of your work in the Google Classroom as a resource. Maybe have a look at it. It's a lot more detailed than I think you might need to know, but it's good to hear it from another voice. So have a look at that. The other thing that you're going to need to do, and this will all be attached to the lesson here as well if you get this, there is worksheet number 2 that you worked on in the last concept. Question number 3 on that will you can be doing at this point as a bit of reinforcement of what you're learning. And then don't forget about the image I just showed you. You can go back to that at any point. And then lastly, there's this little lab that I'm going to put up. It's not a lab, it's more analyzing data and having a look at what's going on. I'm going to encourage you guys to do it, hand it in, and we'll make it a bit of a lab mark for this section. If you need help with it, of course, find me online and we can have a discussion and sort that out. But you can find that as an assignment in the Google Classroom as well. And like I said, we'll put a little bit of a summative mark to it under your lab section in the mark book. I'll put up a little practice assignment for you with a few questions for you guys to move through that'll give you an idea of what I might ask on a quiz. And then, of course, in a short while, I will post the quiz as well and give you an opportunity to get your summative mark for this section. Don't forget, if you need help, find me online. If the quizzes aren't going well, I need some feedback from you on what I can be doing a little bit differently, and seek that extra help. And we can always look at doing a rewrite if that's necessary. So I hope that pretty much covers everything. Find me online if you need to have any questions answered, and please stay healthy.